Matt Pottinger has been a reporter in China. After that, he served as a U.S. Marine deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan. He spent 4 years in senior roles in the White House National Security Council, including as Senior Director for Asia and Deputy National Security Advisor. His research revealed the true agenda of the Chinese Communist Party, a hostile reality that too many in the foreign policy community, in America and in Europe, had long preferred not to see. He's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he's chairman of FTD's China program. And he's the editor of a new book, The Boiling Moat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. Here, for those watching on YouTube, here it is, The Boiling Moat. And I'm pleased he's with us today. I'm Cliff May, and I'm pleased you're with us too, here on Foreign Policy. Well, welcome, Matt. Welcome, Matt. That sounds funny. Good to see you. Thanks for making the time. I have to tell you, I was thinking Matt Pottinger and The Boiling Moat. Does that not sound like a book by J.K. Rowling?
Yeah, I know it has a Harry Potter-esque.
Pretty clear. Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Matt Pottinger and the Deathly Hallows. I mean, it would work.
Yeah, when my wife was getting tired of me working on this book, she started calling it the Boiling Hot Pot. It was something that was getting in the way of dinner. Oh. So it was the Boiling Hot Pot.
Listen, there are 13 chapters. We could do a podcast on each one. You don't have time, so we're going to have to cherry pick. Though those listening should really buy a copy and just read it all because it's all worth reading. Before we do that, I just have to talk to you a little bit about, shall we say, your unusual American journey. You were born at a young age, and you started learning Mandarin almost immediately, actually in high school, right? Why did you start learning Mandarin Chinese in high school? Quickly as you can.
I wasn't doing well in Spanish, so I picked a harder language.
Mateo, mi amigo, el chino es mucho más difícil que el español.
I had a really tough Spanish teacher my sophomore year in high school, and I knew it wasn't going to go well. So I was looking for any kind of a life raft that I could jump to. So I went to Mandarin, and but it just goes to show you that if you're interested in something and you have a better chance of getting proficient at it. And I actually did enjoy learning Chinese. The language was my portal into everything else related to China, mostly good, the culture and the history, and then of course also the regime there that I ended up covering as part of my time as a reporter there.
Well, just spend a moment on that. So you spoke Mandarin, and that because I assume you didn't work your way up to foreign correspondent for Reuters or the Wall Street Journal by doing the police beat in Trenton for a couple of years.
Well, actually, my first job out of college was working for States News Service.
Oh, I remember States News Service. I do.
There were a lot of reporters who came up through Leland Schwartz's
I knew
States
him.
News Service. He was great. And
people don't know, was when there were a lot of regional papers, which there no longer are, and they couldn't afford to have correspondents in Washington. They kind of rented them out of States News.
That's it.
Yeah, I remember this.
I was a Washington correspondent for hire for several regional or small newspapers. So I was writing for the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey, and the smallest was the Log Cabin Democrat in Conway, Arkansas. That I wrote for, but I also wrote stories for the Chicago Tribune and the Hollywood Reporter and the San Francisco Examiner, and it was a great way for a young aspiring journalist to cut his teeth, and you were writing byline news clips, so I built a portfolio.
Sure,
and on the back of that portfolio covering Washington D.C., I was hired by Reuters news agency to cover China, and so I was brought into the Beijing bureau, working for Andy Brown. Who is a wonderful guy, still a good friend, and one of my early mentors as a journalist.
What a great jump! I mean, right from States News to do, and a little bit when you were in China as a reporter for Reuters and then for the Wall Street Journal. You didn't need a translator, but did they assign you minders, as we call them, anyhow? Did you worry about, being arrested for telling stories the Chinese Communist Party didn't want told?
This was a really interesting time to be in China because this was the late 90s. We're about, almost a decade on from the Tiananmen massacre, which only reinforced paranoid instincts and a bias for over security and all that. But on the other hand, you also had, people moving for the first time in China. They were able to move from the countryside to cities. You had more and more young people working for foreign companies. You had more people going abroad. You had the very beginning of the internet age, right? People were, logging on to Sohu.com and their instant messenger program. And, Sina Weibo didn't even exist yet. And people also had cell phones. So you had this connectivity and there was a lot more information flowing. And it was a very heady time. It was a very optimistic time for China. So I did not have to use translators, but the minders, it was kind of interesting. If I went to a local area of China beyond Beijing, if you were, sometimes you just have to try to arrange that beforehand with the foreign ministry. If you were going on your own without letting them know in advance, you usually had a limited amount of time before they would discover you and either send the police for you or a minder from the Waiban, which is like the foreign affairs office of the local government. And so sometimes, I had a rule. It was sort of like a Thurgood Marshall's rule, which was get out of town before sundown. Like you basically had 12 hours to get your reporting done before you were inevitably discovered by the police. And so I remember one time I broke that rule when I was working on a corruption story in Jiangsu province, in a pretty rural part of Jiangsu province. And it was just like a classic, grapes of wrath thing where the big state-owned enterprise was taking land from farmers without their consent, barely giving them, if any kind of compensation. It was totally inadequate. And so these farmers were meeting with me and talking to me, and the police had been repurposed to basically, do the equivalent of covering their badges and beating the heck out of people. And so I against my better judgment, I didn't leave at sundown. I stayed in order to meet with some of the families, these farmers who had been were homeless because their homes had been requisitioned. And I got arrested.
Oh, you did? Uh-huh.
Soon after I interviewed these people, someone caught on to me, and I ended up spending the next 6 hours being interrogated in a rural police station, just hoping, I was trying to figure out how to send some kind of signal somewhere to let someone know where I was.
And then they let you go? They didn't, they just kind of thought they'd intimidate you and let you go?
It was an interesting thing. I had to write this sort of like, confession document that they drafted. And I flushed some of my notes down the toilet so that they wouldn't discover names of some of the people that I'd been talking to. And I said, look, I promised not to write the story. And they eventually brought in someone from the foreign ministry. So then I knew at least there were two agencies of the Chinese government that knew I was there. So I wasn't going to get, I wasn't going to be made to wear cement shoes. And they drove me to the edge of town after midnight and said never to come back. And I was able to get hire a car, and I drove 3.5 hours to Nanjing. So anyway, I ended up writing the story anyway, by the way. It was that story ran on the front page, at least of the Asian edition.
I'll just mention, in this, I think Russia today is worse than the Soviet Union was back then. With what happened with Evan Gershkovich. I mean, he was an accredited journalist, and they keep him like that. I'll just mention this because you'll find it interesting. When I used to want to get away from minders in Russia and in the Soviet Union, I'd go to bed early at the hotel. Then I'd go out later, go sit like on a park bench, put a pack of Marlboros next to me. Somebody would always come up and ask for a smoke, and we'd start talking. And if I got caught, I'd say, well, I couldn't sleep, so I just went out for a walk. And I'd agree with whoever I talked about that they were telling me about the why socialism was better than capitalism, and explaining that to me at great length. That was our cover story. Anyway,
Yeah, that's great.
all right.
That's
So,
great.
okay, so you're at the point where you were a big-time foreign correspondent with one of the best newspapers in the world. You could go back to New York. You could be an editor. You could have expensive lunches on the Wall Street Journal at fancy restaurants. And instead you decide, no, I think I'll be a U.S. Marine. And it's not because the food is better. That's, I mean.
That's right. MREs.
MREs instead you figure I can type, so surely I can shoot. I mean, what was the thinking there?
That's right. I just love those MRE meat patties.
Meals ready to eat. I remember from my
that just the sound it would make as you let it slide the patty out of the foil package, and then to eat the jalapeno cheese sauce, which Marines ironically called jalapeno sauce. So I made a decision. I was moving towards some kind of a decision to do something radically different in late 2004. Because of all the events that had taken place over the previous few years, starting with 9/11.
Right.
I had a near miss at 9/11. I was visiting from the Hong Kong bureau. I was back in New York to visit our headquarters, which was at the World Financial Center, right across the street from the World Trade Center. And I was going to meet with John Bussey, the foreign editor, and with Paul Steiger, the managing editor. I had meetings that morning. My father had wanted me to consider going to Windows on the World for breakfast with him.
Which is in the World Trade Tower, in case anyone doesn't know that.
Yeah,
yes.
No one survived who was above a certain floor, including up at the Windows on the World restaurant. I told him that I would rather work on developing some of my story ideas because I was about to meet with the top editors of the paper. And so, and I was jet lagged. I wanted to get a little more sleep. And so we drove in to town from Westchester County, where his home was, and the planes hit on our way down the West Side Highway. So we heard it all unfolding, all the confusion and all that, just listening to talk radio, and so the world had changed. Obviously, that day, I didn't know exactly how it had changed, but I began thinking about some of the things that I might do to serve the country more directly. I think journalism at its best is a form of public service, but I was had influence from my stepfather, who'd been an Air Force officer. He was a West Point grad who became an Air Force officer. His father was a West Point grad who was a U.S. Army Air Force pilot flying B-17s in World War II. So I grew up with service in close proximity, people that I looked up to in my home, my stepdad and his dad. And so I began thinking about doing something more direct, and I ended up in the Marine Corps.
Okay, and then you went into government. How did you make the transition from the Marine Corps into government? I'm nosy, I know, but you're a recovering journalist, so you understand that character flaw.
Yeah, look, I spent 5 years on active duty as a Marine. I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. When I came back to the U.S., by that point I'd been gone for 13 years. I'd been away, for almost a decade as a correspondent for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal in China, and then I was in Iraq and Afghanistan and Japan as a Marine. I was, America felt pretty foreign at that point coming back. I had left before the internet age, and I came back in 2010, and people were attacking each other on Twitter. I started a small business that was doing investigative research, also sort of like open source and other research into China, and began doing some writing. And I got a phone call after the 2016 election from Mike Flynn and also from KT McFarland, who would become the first national security advisor and deputy national security advisor for Donald Trump. And I knew them both. I'd served with Mike Flynn in Afghanistan and knew KT McFarland from New York City, where I was living. We were friends. And they both asked me to come over to Trump Tower to talk to them about China and North Korea primarily. And I ended up writing a couple of lengthy memos, a couple of dozen page memos that were provisional strategies for what I thought the United States should be doing with respect to China and with respect to North Korea. And one day, KT and Mike Flynn brought me up to meet the president-elect, Donald J. Trump, in December of 2016. That was my first time ever meeting him. And it was a pretty good first taste of what it would be like to, for the many hundreds of hours that would follow briefing him in the Oval Office. That the conversation just went all over the place. It was everywhere but where I had thought it was going to go until the end, and then we went to the subject that I was there to brief him on, and he liked me, and KT and Mike asked me to come on board. So I started on the first day of the Trump administration. It was unexpected, and I stayed almost until the very end. And I'm very proud of that service.
Indeed, and this is very important. You came to understand Xi Jinping through the most extraordinary means. You listened to what he was saying in Mandarin, and you read what he was writing, or at least publishing under his own byline in Mandarin. And in Mandarin, to his comrades, he wasn't lying, as I'm sure he does when talking through translators, to American presidents and secretaries of the Treasury, and of course to John Kerry. And you realize that the perception of him and what he was up to was very different from what was the sort of conventional wisdom.
That's right. And of course I had help from this, even though I could read Chinese and speak reasonably well. Learning how to read Communist Party documents it's painful. It is not easy. It is not intuitive. It was Pierre Ryckmans who would publish under the name Simon Leys, who said, reading, Communist Party doctrine and documents is like eating sawdust by the bucketful. But you have to eat all that dry wood in order to find those slivers of insight. And I'm lucky that I have had colleagues over the years and still now, people like John Garneau, who's an Australian, also former journalist, and Matthew Johnson, who worked at the Hoover Institution for a time with me, and people who really do know how to read these documents, and so I've learned a lot from them, and have eaten a lot of sawdust to try to and the more you do it, and with guidance, the more you realize that those internal facing, as you said, those internal facing speeches, when Xi Jinping is not trying to reach, the ears of Joe Biden or, Ursula von der Leyen or some more Western leader, he's trying to give guidance to the party faithful, the rank and file. And some of that stuff has to get published in order to reach, the 90 plus million members of the Chinese Communist Party. And so that stuff tends to come out in places that are not bedtime reading or news sites that you would go to. A lot of it doesn't come out on the Xinhua News Agency. A lot of it comes out in things like usher, which is Seeking Truth magazine, and some of the other party sort of theoretical journals. I read it for the jokes and interviews, not for the pictures. Yeah, exactly. This is just brutal reading. It's mind numbing often, but there is a lot of important. You start to see these patterns, and there's a lot of reference, very deliberate, careful reference to language that has been used before. So as you start to look at certain phrases that Xi Jinping's using, and you look back in time, for example. You look at something like common prosperity, this phrase that just started to kind of emerge a few years ago again. 共同富裕. Xi Jinping keeps talking common prosperity. What does that mean? Why is he using that? Matthew Johnson went back and read through all of the back issues, searched the back issues of the People's Daily, which is the Communist Party mouthpiece newspaper, and found that this phrase, 共同富裕, common prosperity, was used primarily early in the Mao Zedong era as the stock phrase he used for taking control of all of the private tycoons' assets. That in other words, all business flowed into the hands of the party, and in fact, many of those tycoons were either imprisoned or died from suicide. And so Xi Jinping is consciously hearkening back to 1953 to borrow the same language that Mao used when he obliterated the private sector. So that's interesting. That context matters. And so that's what we tried to do with a lot of the work we've done together and at my little firm Garneau Global. And Matt Johnson and David Feith and I published a piece in late 2022 in Foreign Affairs magazine called Xi Jinping in His Own Words, where we tried to highlight what we think are some of the most important statements and speeches that Xi Jinping's given.
By the way, I just have to mention this, and I'll tell you why. There were some dissenters early on about the relationship with China. Richard Bernstein and Ross Monroe wrote a book called The Coming Conflict with China in 1997, and the book argued that the conflict would dominate the early 21st century, and it advocated various steps to counter what the authors saw as China's threat to the U.S. And the reason I have to mention that, Richard Bernstein happens to be one of my oldest friends in the world. We sat next to each other on the Metro desk of the New York Times way back when.
He saw Around the Corner, and I remember his book, and I remember reading his book and being interested in it. But I wish I had paid much closer attention or put more emphasis on that potential future. Another that really did have a big impact on my thinking was James Mann's book, which was called The China Fantasy, that came out, I want to say 2007, somewhere around then, give or take a year. And that was another one where, it was a short, well-argued book that said, what if both propositions are wrong? The idea that China is going to peacefully evolve into a more liberal system. What if that turns out to be wrong? And in fact, China does, acquire immense material wealth that it can use to build a powerful military and to advance its influence in the world. But it far from liberalizing in any other sense, it actually becomes more and more autocratic. And that's exactly what has happened in the 2 decades since he wrote that.
Yeah, I mean, Bill Clinton was largely responsible, I think you'll agree, for bringing People's Republic of China into the WTO, World Trade Organization. And when he did that, he said, I think it was his view, and I don't think many people contradicted it at the time. It was a reasonable view. If we can make China richer, it'll become more moderate and more liberal and a good stakeholder in a system where we dominate, but it'll be in its interests economically and in other ways. Yeah. Also, people who are wealthier will demand more freedom, no reason for the government not to give it to them. In a way, it was a noble experiment. The question is, at what point should it have been clear that the experiment failed? I'm not sure.
I'd agree. I'd agree with you that it's like, that President Clinton was representing the zeitgeist of that time in both parties and across all of our alliances. There was a sense that history was, on our side and the wind was in our sails, and the Soviet Union had just come to naught. And so it was only a matter of time. So, and I, in all honesty, I indulged some of that wishful thinking as well. So I don't hold that against any particular official from that era, and especially in the 90s. But by the time China had come into the WTO, and far from accelerating its reforms and far from accelerating its opening of its markets, it actually began to close down again. Certainly things kind of stalled out in terms of reform. That should have been a clue for us. And many of my Chinese friends will tell me, hey, numbskull, the real signal was 1989 when, the Chinese Communist Party mowed down probably, more than 1,000 of its kids, to reassert
in Tiananmen Square.
Control. That should have been that should, the smell of that cordite should have been what woke us up.
Instead, the U.S. government quickly forgave China for that. Oh, let's put that behind us.
Let's put that behind us, because the Cold War was still on. We were still, George H.W. Bush did not want that to derail the triangulation that Nixon had inaugurated. by trying to pull China closer to us and further from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was still up and running at the time of the Tiananmen massacre. The Berlin Wall didn't fall until later that year. And of course, within a couple of years after that, the Soviet Union itself was gone. So at that point, I think was really when we should have revisited and tested, had a better debate about some of the assumptions that we developed.
And speaking of the Soviet Union, as somebody who spent a lot of time studying the declension of Russian verbs, tell me if you think about, is it fair to say that Xi Jinping is sort of a Stalinist in at least three ways? He believes capitalism is doomed. He believes the spread of socialism globally is inevitable. He believes it's his job to accelerate capitalism's death and socialism's spread and make sure that his form of socialism, in this case, socialism with Chinese characteristics, comes to dominate, that the CCP comes to dominate. And of course, that also includes, this is from the Boiling Moat, you quote this, that includes the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Yeah.
Yeah, Stalin is a very good place to start. By the way, I can't tell you how glad I am that you don't have to conjugate verbs in Chinese. This is,
well, that's a big advantage. You got tones.
This is why I fled Spanish for Chinese.
You don't have to conjugate verbs. You have to conjugate verbs. You don't have to decline. You don't have to decline the nouns. All right.
That's it.
We're walking out here.
But you have to learn how to write thousands of characters. So somehow. The Stalin is not a bad place to start because Joseph Stalin, if you go back to Xi Jinping's first major address that we know about, it was in late 2012, right after he'd been elevated. And he gives a secret speech. The only reason we know about it is I'm not sure this one has ever been published by the Chinese government. I'd have to go back and check, but it did get leaked. And in this speech, he basically tells the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the lessons he draws. It's a parable, it's a cautionary tale. And Xi Jinping says, among other things, that the Soviet Communist Party, the moment it decided to turn its back on Lenin and Stalin, was really the beginning of the end. And he referred to it as historical nihilism.
When did it start? When did it turn its back in his view? Do you remember?
Well, he doesn't state it in the speech, but it's very clear that he's referring to Khrushchev's rise.
Right. Khrushchev's speech against Stalin. Right.
So what Xi Jinping is much more explicit in identifying Gorbachev as a villain. He's really a villain in the story.
He's not. He is a heretic, certainly. Yeah.
He's a heretic, and Khrushchev is an implied heretic.
Right.
And so we probably should have paid even closer attention than we did back in late 2012 when we learned in the months that followed that Xi Jinping viewed Khrushchev as a wimp.
Right. Yeah.
The guy who was famous for banging his shoe on the table at the UN saying, "We will bury the West." Xi Jinping thought that guy was a nihilistic, slacker, who what really needed to happen was a more fulsome embracing of Lenin and Stalin,
including the Gulag Archipelago, let's understand, including the torture and murder of millions of dissidents.
Millions of his own people and his own party members.
Yeah, and not all dissidents, by the way. Right, yeah.
It's like Stephen Kotkin, the historian, says Hitler killed his enemies, but Stalin killed his friends.
Yeah.
So Xi Jinping uses purges and the humiliation and the jailing of officials much more often than he uses, the killing of them. So but the essence of the approach is still very much the same. It is about how you have to constantly purge the party of anyone wearing the guise of a reformer. And Stalin, in his short course on the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, that ghost written book that was one of the top, in China, it was like the Bible in the 1950s, that book. And so that says that you have to constantly purge the party of its own people.
There's a quote in your book that you take, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but you'll know what I'm talking about, where Xi Jinping quotes Mao saying, "It's okay to ruin your own country if a new country is reborn from that. You remember what I'm referring to?
I do. Yeah, this was now Xi Jinping in late 2021 gave a major address where he's really reviewing 100 years of Chinese Communist Party history, and it is an anti-American speech. I would argue it's an anti-Deng Xiaoping and anti-reform and opening speech as well, not through anything he says, but through what he omits saying. He kind of airbrushes, he demotes everyone between him and Mao, in essence. But he also talks a lot about the Korean War in this speech.
Right.
And during as he's talking about the Korean War, he praises Mao Zedong for having what he said was the strategic foresight and fortitude to throw one punch now to avoid 100 punches later, which is sort of an argument in favor of preemption, preemptive conflict. But he also says he also had the courage of being willing to destroy the country internally in order to rebuild it anew. Now, that is quite a striking phrase that he chose to quote Mao, who used that phrase in the context of the Korean War, going into the Korean War. But I have heard this is anecdotally, but I've heard it from a number of Chinese sources that the Chinese Communist Party, when you're a Communist Party member, you have to attend all of these study sessions all the time and to talk about certain readings that they assign. I'm told that passage is one of the passages that was emphasized after Xi gave that speech. So everyone, all 90 million party members, had to study this phrase and the spirit of this phrase, destroy the country internally in order to rebuild it anew, and to study fighting the United States on the Korean Peninsula.
Then that's very important to keep in mind when you're thinking about the possibility of a war between China and the U.S., that he has that image in mind, that he'll ruin the country in order to rebuild it if necessary. And this could be a whole other podcast, I realize, but you mentioned Deng Xiaoping. Listeners should know that's an earlier paramount leader of China. Unfair question in short, or was Deng Xiaoping was he more open to détente and rapprochement and a better relationship, or was it just a different period? This is a debate that you know better than I goes on among China specialists. Was Deng Xiaoping different, or was he just saying, build your power, bide your time, we'll get to where Xi Jinping now is eventually?
I think it's both. I mean, and what's interesting, that speech I was just talking to you about, Xi Jinping's speech, the one time he mentions Deng Xiaoping in a positive light was when he credits Deng Xiaoping for the Tiananmen massacre in that speech. He says that when we hit the turmoil of 1989, he's referring to the student demonstrations. He talked about how Deng's resolve saved the party and saved the country by mowing down all those kids. So
good Stalinist action.
But it speaks. It's a way of trying to begin to answer your question. Deng Xiaoping was also a Leninist. Okay, this is a guy who believed that there should not be, as he put it, there should not be a trace of Western parliamentary democracy in the Chinese system. He was very clear about that. But he also believed that China could grow strong through a different economic model, experimenting with things like the Shenzhen Economic Zone, which started as a fishing village, where he sort of said, look, they can kind of emulate Hong Kong right there on the Hong Kong border. Shenzhen ends up growing up to be bigger than Hong Kong, just a generation later.
But not a financial capital the way Hong Kong was and is.
Technology and manufacturing.
Okay, yeah.
So, but a larger city that started with a couple tens of thousands of people, it's now I can't remember, somewhere around 10 million people, and wealthy and so forth. So he wanted to experiment with market mechanisms, letting the market do more and having the government get out of the way of the Chinese people more on purely matters of business. But he was by no means someone who believed that the Chinese model politically should evolve into something different. And he was also highly suspicious and really did view the U.S. as an enemy, even as he courted closer ties and more trade and more technology transfer and more transfers of students from China to the United States. Even as he was doing all of those things, which really paid off for China as a whole, but also for the Chinese Communist Party, he viewed the United States as an adversary. And I think that Rush Doshi contributed something important. Rush Doshi was President Biden's, one of his China directors on the NSC, who's now at the Council on Foreign Relations. But he published a book doing, this hard work of eating sawdust, reading, primary source documents, biographies by former Chinese officials, autobiographies and memoirs and documents. And he found that Deng Xiaoping came to regard the U.S., especially with the demise of the Soviet Union. The U.S. became the Chinese Communist Party's chief geopolitical, ideological, and military adversary. So when he says China should hide its capabilities and bide its time and not seek leadership, implicit in that is, in this phrase, bide your time, is that this is a temporary phase until Beijing has enough power to enter a new phase. And so I think in that sense, Xi Jinping is in that sense continuity from Deng Xiaoping, even though he is parted with decisively with Deng Xiaoping's economic model. He is basically dropping the fig leaf and saying we don't need to hide and bide anymore. We can confront the United States directly, including through proxy wars, by backing the Russians in their war in Europe. NATO has now declared China the decisive enabler of that war. Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, said that China is, quote, overwhelmingly the number one supporter of the war. And of course, they're also the number one material supporter of Iran. And now they're hosting Iran's terrorist proxy groups in Beijing, like Hamas.
Right. And also another quote you use in this book and you have used elsewhere, which is very important, suggesting that Xi Jinping also thinks that the global situation is now more
opportune
than ever before. What he told Vladimir Putin, where now we can help bring about, quote, changes unseen in a century. And
the great benefit of that quotation was it was the first time that Xi openly declared himself and Vladimir Putin as the architects of all of this chaos and change. He said there are changes occurring that happen but once in a century, and you and I, Vladimir, are the ones driving that change. So I thought it was evident that was the case when they had their entente and their no limits pact. But you still had a lot of people in the West saying no. You still have people incredibly who say no. Xi Jinping is he's got really mixed feelings about this war. His mixed feelings are about the fact that Putin hasn't won it yet. So he's helping him more to make sure that he finishes the job and wipes Ukraine off the map. So once he had that statement with Putin, it was out in the open. By the way, it was at that visit when Xi Jinping visited the Kremlin in March of 2023. That was the moment when China's material support for the war exploded. Off the charts levels of material support for the war machine, for Russia's war machine. And that has continued unabated, and China has yet to pay any price for waging a proxy war against Europe.
And we also know, in terms of his grand plan, something else, which people who are engaged in wishful thinking refuse to see. Another phrase that I highlighted when I read it in the book. It sounds nice in an Orwellian kind of way, but it expresses his ambition: a community of common destiny for mankind. That sounds so nice, so neighborly, if you will.
Yeah. This phrase is important. Liza Tobin, who worked on the National Security Council staff for both the Trump and Biden administrations. She was also one of the China directors there working with Rush Doshi. She was the first who wrote, I think, in some depth about how important that phrase is. And when she wrote about that, back in 2018, something like that, 2017, 18. And she was writing for the Texas National Security Review. That phrase does encapsulate this idea, because it's so vague sounding that a lot of people parrot it, thinking that it's anodyne or even positive. Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum parrots this phrase.
Does he
Community
really?
of common destiny for mankind.
Oh.
He is. And but what it really represents, I've no idea whether Mr. Schwab knows this or not, but he should read Liza Tobin's article in the National Security Review. It encapsulates the idea of really making the world safe for authoritarianism. That is what it is about. And so he applies this phrase to everything now. He now talks about a community of common destiny for mankind in space. And that is about China dominating, that domain, extraterrestrial domains and interplanetary exploration and satellite constellations. And so it's not a phrase that should make anyone feel warm and fuzzy inside.
All right. You call your book The Boiling Moat. Maybe you should explain for a second what you mean by the boiling moat.
Well, look, Taiwan has a disadvantage of geography and one major advantage of geography. And the disadvantage, of course, is that they're only about 100 miles from the People's Republic of China. The good news is they have a natural moat surrounding them called, the Western Pacific and the Taiwan Strait. And if Ukraine had only had 100 miles of ocean separating it from Russia, it would have been a much taller order for Vladimir Putin to invade a sovereign neighbor. So that moat is where we should demonstrate. I mean the United States, but also Taiwan and our allies like Japan and Australia. We should demonstrate that we have the ability to make that moat uncrossable, uninhabitable, in fact, and to turn it into a boiling moat. That phrase, boiling moat, comes from a phrase, 金城汤池, which was a phrase used by a Han Dynasty statesman who was using it to describe how, if even a skilled general should not attack hard points. They should try to find another way to subjugate them. And so it's about making Taiwan a hard point by focusing on that Tangchi, the boiling moat. Because if China cannot move its men and equipment across that strait, primarily through ships, it's not going to be able to credibly threaten to conquer and occupy Taiwan. And so it is really about turning that strip of water into the most uninhabitable place on Earth. And I was glad to see that Admiral Sam Paparo, Pappy, who's now the commander of Indo-Pacific Command, has been talking about turning the strait into a hellscape. That's his phrase for it. And hellscape now encompasses a whole program for trying to make the strait uncrossable. What we focus on in the book are a lot of existing technologies, because we think it'll be very helpful to field new technologies, some of which are being tested in the battlefields of Ukraine right now. But because time is of the essence, we think that existing technologies, existing platforms, and existing munitions are what we should be making sure we have in sufficient quantities, especially those munitions, anti-ship missiles, for example, to be able to give Sam Paparo all kinds of options about how he can make life miserable for the People's Liberation Army and for Xi Jinping. We argue that we want to give our commanders multiple options. They shouldn't have to depend on one exquisite plan that has to go perfectly. When does that ever happen in war? I can tell you, it's like Dwight D. Eisenhower said. He said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. You want our commanders to have multiple options available. So we focus on a lot of the capabilities that we should be doubling down on. And a lot of it is about our defense industrial base and ensuring that we can produce munitions fast enough to persuade Xi Jinping that we could actually fight and stay in a fight for as long as it takes to defeat an invasion.
Right, which we're not doing yet. We're doing a little better, from what I understand, but not nowhere near what.
Ironically, the war in Ukraine has made us a little bit better.
Yes.
Our defense industrial base. A lot of people say, "Well, geez, we're losing all of our weapons to Ukraine." Actually, we have replenished the U.S. arsenal by most of the money that we're giving to Ukraine actually goes to American industry to make more weapons that will be available to the United States, but it is also exposed how much farther we need to go in order to, be able to face a juggernaut like the People's Republic of China.
Admiral Mark Montgomery, who works here at FDD, who you know well, talks a lot about that. And as does Brad Bowman and Craig Singleton, also FDD. It's money going to American factories, to American workers, to having skilled workers in those factories and more of them, and replenishing our own supplies while giving the old weapons and the old munitions to Ukraine or to Israel or to Taiwan, all of whom need it very badly.
They're absolutely right. We are more formidable because of our help to Ukraine. And if we don't abandon Ukraine, but actually help them bravely fight, they're not asking for Americans to go fight. What's the big deal? These are the bravest people in Europe. They are the front line, protecting Europe. If we do turn our back on them, it will be much more expensive for us in the long run, even in the short run, to have to then defend a new front line in Europe that bulges all the way into Central Europe and all along the Polish border and Romania. We don't want to be in that position. That will be more expensive than supporting brave Ukrainians fighting against invaders.
Well, you make this point frequently, and a lot of us make this point. Deterrence is, however expensive deterrence is, it's cheaper than fighting a war and much cheaper than losing a war. So you want to spend whatever is necessary in deterrence. Now, here's the counter argument would be, okay, but President Biden doesn't want to provoke Putin because Putin has nuclear weapons and the ability to deliver them. But if you show that you can be intimidated and successfully blackmailed by anyone who has nuclear weapons, then certainly the People's Republic of China will do that to you. No reason for North Korea not to do that to you. And pretty soon the Islamic Republic of Iran will do that to you. And if your pattern is we back down when threatened, we don't deter, we are deterred, well, you know what the next century is going to look like for my kids and my grandkids. Once you say that, it means the Cold War has been lost. We only won a battle. That's what it means, essentially. Now, should we have better missile defense and better defense against nuclear weapons? We should, and we've gone a lot of years without spending any money on developing proper defense against nuclear attack.
No, you said it better than I could have said it, and it is paradoxical. Sometimes people struggle with it, but I think most Americans do get this, and especially when our leaders explain it. It is that in order to keep the peace, you have to show that you have the capability and resolve to fight wars, and win them. Otherwise. This goes back to George Washington's first address to Congress after he was inaugurated. He spoke about this, and it's encapsulated in a phrase that emerged since called "peace through strength." It's more than a slogan. It is actually it is a grand strategy encapsulated in 3 words, and I hope that we'll return to that. It's one of these things that we just forget every generation, and then we have to relearn. And it's just a question of how hard the lesson is that we have to learn before we revive, smart strategies.
And it actually goes back to Roman times. I won't try to do the Latin, but the phrase, if you want peace, prepare for war. Right.
That's
This has been known. And I should also mention, just for listeners who didn't, last week's Foreign Policy podcast was with Mark Montgomery and Craig Singleton talking about the recent mission we did. Unfortunately, without you, your name was brought up many times.
It was terrific.
And part of what we looked at is, okay, if we're successful and Xi Jinping says, okay, kinetic conquest it doesn't look like a good idea. What are the other ways I can do it with cyber warfare, with financial warfare, all of the what else is there? And trying to help the Taiwanese think it through and prepare for these other kinds of contingencies which are out there. And I think that was a useful exercise for them and for us to kind of think through that. I mean, one of the reasons that Xi Jinping, I just mentioned this, that Xi Jinping might want to be careful about kinetic action, amphibious assaults and missiles raining down is there's something called the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, and you want to keep that intact and take that over. You write in the book, Taiwan's significance for semiconductor production is far greater than that of all members of OPEC combined for oil. And people listening probably know this, but they should, that when we're talking about semiconductors, and this is the very highest end of semiconductors, Mark Montgomery explained this better than I can last week on the program, we're talking about something as essential to the world economy and certainly to the American economy as oil has been, and I would argue remains to this day.
Yeah, it'll feel to us, those who still remember the shock in the 1970s when, depending on what your license plate numbers were, you could or couldn't buy gas for your car on that day.
I do remember.
Long lines. This will feel like that, only worse, because it's also going to be reflected in a collapse of everyone's stock portfolios and their pensions. And that's because the most valuable companies in America, the ones that you can't avoid investing in practically if you invest in any mutual fund almost or any index like the S&P 500, the most valuable companies all depend on Taiwan semiconductors for their livelihoods. And so whether it's NVIDIA or Apple or Microsoft or AWS, Amazon, on down the list, if that chip supply is cut off, either because of war, and a blockade, or the consequences of a war, if they're damaged or if they're hard to revive because a lot of the talent will flow out of Taiwan and we'll start trying to rebuild elsewhere, there is going to be a profound, long shock to our economy and to stock markets in ways that every American will feel.
So, speaking of the economy, Chinese economy right now looks not so good. My question is, when the economy is not good, if you think like an American, you think, well, I've got to build the economy before I embark on foreign adventures. But you also might think, okay, the economy is not going to be so good. Let me conquer Taiwan, and that's a much more important. And here's another question to answer with this. Xi Jinping constantly talks about this as the reunification of China with Taiwan. I think it's a conquest. I don't think it's reunification. One, because people in Taiwan don't want it, and so it's not reunification. Two, historically, Taiwan was part of China during the Manchu-led imperialist dynasty. I'm not sure it's entirely part of mainland China.
The People's Republic of China has never governed any piece of Taiwan.
Okay.
And the China going back to antiquity has very rarely governed Taiwan. And when it has, it's usually only been a coastal strip of it. So yeah, this isn't something that is inherently evident in history. China's argument is actually an uphill argument in my view. But this phrase, actually tongyi in Chinese of unification, like you said, this is something that when we agreed back in the 1970s to establish ties, to recognize the People's Republic of China and negotiated communiques, it was always predicated, our ties with China were predicated on the idea that the question, as Xi Jinping calls it, the Taiwan question, would be settled peacefully and with the consent of people on both sides. So we are a status quo power on this question. It doesn't matter if you're talking about President Donald Trump or you're talking about President Biden or you're talking about Jimmy Carter. There has been continuity going back to 1979 when we reestablished ties, continuity with this idea that there has to be peace between Taiwan and the mainland. And then all kinds of great things are possible based on that premise. And so it is only now that Xi Jinping is really in a systemic, alarming kind of way threatening the status quo, saying that the status quo is not good enough. In fact, Taiwan must move toward the mainland. And so when he met with President Biden in San Francisco last November, he said, I am now calling for American support for my position that China must unify or annex Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. This is anti-status quo. This is disruptive. And so we should never forget that. We sometimes tie ourselves in knots thinking, oh, are we somehow provoking this? No, it's very hard to find variation in the fundamental position from Jimmy Carter all the way to Joe Biden.
Right. And the question of whether the poor economy of China makes Xi Jinping more bellicose or less. What's
look? It is a crummy economy. When Joseph Stalin is your spirit animal politically, there are consequences to that economically, and so the economy is hemorrhaging people. Many of China's entrepreneurs and a lot of people who are much further down on the social strata are voting with their feet. Anyone who can get out is getting out. You have a mass exodus. Right? I mean, this is the world's second superpower after the United States, and it is hemorrhaging its people, including many of its most talented people. So, what does that tell you? It tells you that he has a failing economic model, but that doesn't mean that he is therefore going to be chastened into restraint in terms of other vectors of power that he has at his disposal. And that's why I think he's taking more risk right now. Now that he has a soft economy, he is taking more risk in backing proxy wars against our interests in the Middle East, against Europe's interests in Europe. The fact that he's sponsoring Nicolas Maduro, this tin pot joke of a dictator who's destroyed Venezuela. Millions of people have left Venezuela by foot. They've just walked out of the country to Colombia or all the way up to the United States. The economy of Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Maduro, this dynamic duo, their economy has collapsed 80%. They've lost 80% of their economy.
Despite the fact it's one of the biggest oil producers in the world.
It is the most grotesquely inept government in our hemisphere. And yet, I mean, they make the Cubans look like they've kind of got things under control. and you've got Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and the Ayatollah pledging their support, offering their congratulations to Maduro for having just stolen an election brazenly. Even the UN recognizes that this is a stolen election. And I think it's very provocative that the United States is not being very vocal or forceful in our response to this stolen. It sends a signal to those same dictators who are right there propping up Maduro that the United States isn't even willing to stand up for its interests in its own front yard. That must be a signal that it's time for us to move in places farther away from the United States.
And that gets back to what you were talking about deterrence, and another quote from a chapter you wrote in this book. And this is very much on the minds of the Taiwanese I spoke with when I was there. And you write that deterrence failed in Ukraine and Israel means it stands a greater chance of failing in Taiwan. What this says is the U.S. really needs to up its game, and up its game means what you were talking about, reestablishing peace through strength as the underlying bumper sticker strategy of the United States, which it is not right now.
These are compounding problems. It's the opposite of, you want compounding interest, in your bank account. We see compounding crises of deterrence, and we are going to reap something quite ugly if we don't get our act together soon.
Anything else you want to add? Anything else I should have asked but I neglected to?
No, I'm glad you got a chance to visit Taiwan and meet leaders there. All the better that you're there with Mark Montgomery and Craig Singleton and our FDD colleagues. It's great talking with you, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
It's always great to talk with you. Again, let me remind people, the book is The Boiling Moat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. Get it, read it, you'll learn a lot. Matt Pottinger, thanks for your service now and previously. Great to talk to you.
Thanks, Cliff. It's great to see you.
And good to have all of you with us today here on Foreign Policy.